on behalf of the bank. I'm excited to welcome all of you to this Municipal Investment Fund Energy Smart Workshop Series. I was fortunate to be on one of the workshop series calls a couple weeks ago with some of the similar speakers that we have today. And as somebody who spent the last 15 or so years in this space, including with a number of the people in this room, I learned a tremendous amount from some of the presentations. I know there'll be even more informative today based on some of the modifications, and recognizing that we've got an educated, capable audience here that knows some of this material and is building upon that knowledge. The last, who was I just talking to? Ian, I was just talking to you about the challenges over the past year in the clean energy space, and the pipeline of projects shifting, expectations shifting, incentives shifting. It's made things a bit difficult, but I know there's great work happening. I know the investment and time that folks have put in developing an understanding of projects and being able to develop those projects is continuing to come into fruition. And we also see a lot of the incentives that got put in place a number of years ago are still available, and it's helping to drive those projects in addition to the rising cost of energy, which helps those projects pencil out in an important way. I was also reflecting earlier today on the amount of progress that I've seen over the last 15 years or so and where we were at then. I mean, I remember it was hard to talk about solar projects because they just didn't pencil out, and it was hard to drive those projects forward. And it was very much in the energy efficiency space. And when I think about the growth and development that's happened since that time, I know despite some of the challenges that exist and some of the changes and headwinds, this work will continue and grow. Fifth Third has been involved in sustainability work for the last at least 10 years since I've been here. We've done a lot of work in the operational space, where I started work many years ago, doing everything from LED and building controls and phase change materials, the EV charging stations, and back in 2019 actually moved to 100% renewable power through a large offsite power purchase agreement project, which is down in North Carolina, and sparked our movement into renewable energy, something we've been doing on the financing side for just as long. Beyond that, we've continued to kind of double down the work that we're doing in the sustainable financing space. Back in 2022, we adopted a $100 billion environmental and social finance goal that drives not just our operational work, but really integrating into the lending work that we do as an organization, and have recently passed $50 billion in finance projects and activity within the past year. So that work continues to grow, and I think is really reminiscent of the fact that we see more of this happening in market activity, and we're trying to support that across our portfolios with our customer base. The city of Cincinnati is doing some impressive work. I've really enjoyed watching the work of their team and what's happening across this great city, and want to applaud the city for its focus to bring this session and others to the community and trying to educate and inform so that others can take advantage of the incentives that exist, the resources in the community, and the knowledge that we're trying to bring together. So with that, I will hand it over to Nikki from the city of Cincinnati to move us forward. Yes? You're taking over? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Here, Jeremy. All right. Thank you very much for attending today. Oh, there's a bit of a delay. All right. So today's presenters are, not going to press the button again. There we go. Bit of a delay on those guys. So my name is Nikki Vandevoort. I'm with the Office of Environment and Sustainability at the City of Cincinnati. With me today is Andy Holzhauser from Donovan Energy and Wyatt Ross from CMTA. We will be covering the last of 5 Energy Smart workshops, although if you stay after this one, we have 2 report-related presentations today. Today we have a presentation on our geo-exchange report, and tomorrow actually we will have a presentation on our report on how to leverage House Bill 15, and that will be at the Scripps Center. If you want to sign up for that, there's a QR code over here on the Energy Smart Workshops piece of paper over kind of by the front door. Just to launch into today's presentation and kind of set the stage of where did this start. The city, along with our Green Bank partner, applied to a grant last year, and we were successful. It's called the Municipal Investment Fund. This is phase 1 funding. And the goal of this funding is to build market capacity for clean energy projects, zero emissions buildings, and zero emissions transportation projects. This is an EPA grant originally. The grantor is Coalition for Green Capital through ICLEI for local governments for sustainability. The city was selected in Ohio. There are 49 communities across the nation who got this phase 1 funding, and we are all competing hopefully for phase 2 funding, where they'll select 10 communities. So we've turned in a community-wide public-private partnership plan, as well as a project pipeline of some of these larger scale resilience hubs and clean energy projects and electrification projects and things like that, to draw down private and public investment interest in our region. And I will say that, you know, this training is part of that grant, as well as our 2 reports that we will be launching by the end of this month. And also we've done some training related to energy assessment and operations of buildings in an energy efficient way, to just really strengthen our overall ecosystem of, you know, architects and engineers and demand for these projects on the, you know, business and nonprofit and residential side. So that's kind of the approach that we've taken, trying to strengthen our community. This really falls under the purview of what the Office of Environment and Sustainability really does, which is steward the city's Green Cincinnati plan. The plan, if you haven't read it, is organized into 8 focus groups. We have a buildings and energy specialty, but we also do, our office assists with all manner of things related to sustainability, urban agriculture, food access, waste. We run the recycling program here in Cincinnati. The plan itself has a 50% carbon emissions reduction by 2030 goal, with a 100% carbon neutral goal by 2050. Some of the programs that our office is doing related to energy specifically are listed up here, and I won't go through all of them, but for those of you who work on the sort of maybe multifamily side of things, we have a number of multifamily programs going on right now looking into energy efficiency, electrification, and when you make those improvements, how does that result in both tenant perceived wellness and indoor air quality, as well as the effect of those improvements on their energy bills. We also are in charge of the residential aggregation program for the city, which serves roughly 70,000 to 80,000 residential households and small businesses with 100% renewable energy. And then also, I'll just end here. One of the goals in the Green Cincinnati plan is to train 4,000 employees on green workforce pathways. So my colleague Thanapat Bichachot is our Green Workforce Development Manager and has done an amazing job connecting not only funding opportunities to training programs here in the city, but also actually bringing additional training programs like the Building Performance Institute as well as the Cincinnati Green Workforce Landscape Analysis Report, which was launched last year. So that's kind of an introduction to what OES is up to, how the Municipal Investment Fund kind of plays into our vision and goals with the Green Cincinnati Plan. I'm going to turn it over to Andy for the remainder of sort of this, well, not the remainder. Wyatt's going to also present, but these two are going to present more on the actual technologies, financing, and incentive programs available. Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Great to be with you. Thanks for the time today. First, want to set the stage a little bit, one step deeper than Nikki's introduction, just to provide some context around the forces that helped to bring this together. Nikki mentioned the Cincinnati Green Bank Partners. This is an effort that many of you may be familiar with, an effort that dates back now 3+ years. You've maybe been going to a convening in the past put on by the Cincinnati Green Bank in some way. It is now a series of programs that is housed and led by the Cincinnati Development Fund, but involves a number of different entities. Those efforts have continued to plow forward, to make progress, to open up new financing programs, pilot programs, and the like. Despite some of the changes that have happened at the federal level, there's still a lot of action happening here locally. This is, I think, yet today another example of what is happening, but just wanted to share that that effort still remains very active and has certainly been a component of what has helped us convene today. Oh, there we go. Just a little bit about Donovan Energy, not much at all, only to say that we are based across the street here in downtown Cincinnati. We're about a 10-year-old firm, and we do a range of things focused on both clean energy project development and finance. It'll be my pleasure today to spend time with you all after Wyatt digs in, to dig in then to the financing, some of the magic maybe, and some of the new innovation more than anything, the tools that are out there that have been innovated on, that are changing by the day or by the month, but that help make these things happen. That's kind of how we look at the world, particularly as it relates to the team that we're here with today. I think everybody in the room knows that the cost of particularly electricity is increasing by the day. You see stats that are making that clear every day in some way, whether it's at home or at work, whether it's large scale or small scale. The easy number to use here is 30% increase. I think for those of us that have been in the industry for a little while, particularly on the financial modeling side, when you're trying to model or project out cost of electricity in the future, you're doing this kind of standard copy and paste 3% year-over-year assumption of what electricity costs do in the future based on what they've done the last 30 years. And that's sort of out the door these days, right? And so I think more than anything, you know, this group that's bringing this together is acutely aware of what's going on. And a lot of the things you're going to hear about is recognizing that nobody wants the costs of electricity to go up. However, when they do, it creates yet even better economics for energy efficiency and for clean energy. And so we are going to make light of that and kind of bring that into the focus today. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wyatt. Wyatt's going to give an overview of his company and start to dig into design. I'll be back with you on financing in a little bit.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces. I'm Wyatt Ross. I'm a building performance engineer with CMTA. We are a full-service MEP engineering and consulting firm, really focused on high-performance design, net zero energy, zero emissions. As you can see, we're generally located across most of the country, but we do have an office here in Cincinnati, which is where I am based out of. Has been here for 10+ years. So I guess a quick poll of the room while I see how sensitive this clicker is. Architects and engineers is what this is kind of targeting. So hands up if you're an architect. Okay, engineer. Other. Lots of other. Okay, some in between, some double duty. Great. Well, so really what I want to talk about today, this whole workshop and the series of workshops is about how we leverage energy efficiency on our projects. What does that mean for making good buildings great? And I'm really going to focus on the design considerations that matter. So Andy's got a ton of resources, great tools that he's going to dive into on how we can help our clients and our owners leverage different financing mechanisms or different incentives to really drive performance. But we can really only leverage those tools if our design process is set up in a way to help us monetize those. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. I'm going to start a little philosophical here and ask the question of what is good design? Maybe. Next slide. Okay, see if it bounces forward. I won't touch it again. So thankfully, you guys are a captive audience, and we're not going to actually go into a dialogue here since we do have architects in the room. This could be a conversation that goes all day. But I think it's important because if we want to leverage these tools, we have to first consider how we are taking our projects into the market and what can we do differently to help us leverage these incentives and these financing mechanisms that are available. So if we look around the industry, it wouldn't take us long to find a framework for design excellence. The American Institute of Architects, AIA, has a framework for design excellence. They nicely package this into a series of categories. If you look at this, it would lend yourself to believe that things like energy efficiency, promoting health and well-being, protecting ecosystems, conserving water, all of these are what it means to deliver excellent design. What you will also notice is that there is a bucket for economy. And I think a lot of times on our projects, the loudest voice in the room often ends up becoming this economy bucket. And so I would imagine in my lived experience as a design professional, I'm sure as many of your lived experience as a design professional, you kind of experience something like this on a project. As the design progresses, as you start to reach that ultimate budget limit, you start to have these things that are unprotected and subject to value engineering. And oftentimes those unprotected things are aspects of your sustainability goals or aspects of your high performance design. And so if we're going to kind of remake the opportunity here or figure out alternative ways to deliver our projects, we have to start with understanding kind of what is the fault in our general process. And I would say I empathize with this problem because I think as design professionals, we are often asked to do somewhat the impossible task of delivering a really good project, both very quickly and also as cheaply as possible, right? And if you look at what all of those three things together, what they intersect at is impossibilities, right? And so we're always making trade-offs. And so we are always facing these cost hurdles, and we have to figure out how we balance these three things to still make good projects great. So if we look at kind of traditional process for delivering a project, it might be a little small. You've probably seen variations of this in the past. It's kind of referred to as the McLeany curve often. But the two lines, the black line represents your ability to make an impact on the project. The red line represents the cost to make that impact. And so as you go across the x-axis, as you move further into design and construction, you have less opportunity to make an impact, and it costs more to make that impact. But if we think about typical project delivery, oftentimes the vast majority of the entire project team's effort, so it might phase between architects or design engineers or structural or construction, but if you think about the total team's effort, a lot of times, most of that effort happens later in the design process. And I would call this the production-driven approach. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But if you think of alternative project delivery methods, the ones that are typically referred to in things like LEED or kind of high-performance design, where you're talking about integrated project delivery, those typical efforts shift most of the load, or you kind of get two big pushes, but they shift most of that effort to the beginning of the project phase. And so you're getting underneath that black line where you have more ability to make impact on the project. And I would call this the performance-driven approach. So why do we call that first model the production-driven approach? So in those early phases of design, in order for you to minimize effort there, you have to rely on business as usual experience, right? You're taking advantage of the precedent, the history designing projects. Maybe it's what you've done on a similar building. Maybe it's what you've seen done, common practice in industry. But in order to maintain minimum effort, even though there is a lot of effort, I won't diminish it, you have to rely on business as usual, design practice. In order for us to think differently, again, we have to shift that effort earlier in the project. We have more opportunity to make an impact at lower cost, and what I would consider opening up divergent design thinking. So what is divergent design thinking? What I would frame as divergent design thinking is the ability for us to move away from business as usual, not entirely. We still want to leverage our experience as design professionals, obviously, but really start to understand what are the owners, what are the client's core needs, and what are all the available opportunities to address those needs. Both design strategies, but also what Andy's going to talk about in a little bit. So as we diverge, we can identify what those needs are, identify what the possible solutions are, and then come up with potential solutions, analyze and optimize, and then reconverge on a solution that is going to be best suited for both reaching the project goals, but also aligning with that budget so that we're not set up for VE later in the design process. And so I'm a building performance engineer. I do, performance simulation, energy modeling, daylight modeling. For job security, I would love to tell you that every single one of these analyses are super critical to achieving high performance design, and everyone has to be done on every project. But that is simply not true, right? But we do need to pick the ones that are relevant and are important on our projects so that we can start to, once we analyze those options, narrow them down. And so there are a ton of resources. I think, in general, people like to talk about all of the importance of these analyses that we can do, but there are decades upon decades of best practices that have been well documented in a plethora of industry resources that we have the ability to pull from as designers and as engineers. So I've pointed to a couple. You've got the Advanced Energy Design Guides from ASHRAE. AIA has published several articles on integrating performance or building performance simulation. There's a number of these. And so the point is it's less about the what that we need to do, and it's more about the how. And so that is why the process piece matters so much. So at my company, we have a process that we call the first 30. You could really call this anything you want. The point of it is again, moving to this performance-based design approach, we need to push collaboration and analysis and opportunity finding earlier into the design process. And so through a series of stakeholder engagements with the client, with the owner, with the entire design and construction team, what strategies, what goals can we set? What opportunities can we identify? And how do we iterate through those to kind of refine and narrow down on the ones that are going to be best suited for our project? And so we talked about the framework for design excellence and the different buckets. I am a huge proponent of setting measurable targets. You can't manage what you don't measure. And so we set kind of ambiguous targets for our projects. We're just going to reach LEED certification XYZ. We aren't going to be able to track very effectively what we're working towards in design. Whereas in all of these buckets that exist, there are actual measurable targets that at the end of the day, you can say for sure whether you met them or not when your project goes into operation. So whether that's energy or well-being metrics, water, et cetera, these are all things that we can measure and track as we proceed through design. And yes, that even means the budget and making sure that we're tracking both the life cycle cost requirements and we're getting the rate of return we want to see and also staying within the budget. So what does that actually look like in design? Well, in general, I'm a big proponent of taking this efficiency first approach. And so if you think about the general performance goals that you might have as they relate to energy efficiency, a lot of times we talk about things like, reducing how much energy consumption there is overall. Then we talk about electrification, and then you might have a conversation about renewable energy. And then now there's kind of the blossoming discussion happening around reducing embodied carbon. The reason that we focus on energy efficiency first, and we'll talk about this more, focusing on efficiency first best practices is what's going to make all of those other things much easier and much more cost effective. So we're going to look at a real project example. This is an energy use intensity chart. So if you think of that as like the miles per gallon for a building, so it is looking at how much energy per square foot does a building use. And in this particular case, it's breaking down all of the individual end uses. So what's driving energy in this building? This is a real project. It's a middle school. That was in design. If you look at this, it's pretty obvious, I think, from the jump, you can see what's driving energy consumption, 51% coming from heating energy. And so if we think about how are we going to influence design and influence performance on this project, manage the budget, we need to focus on heating, or at least partially. So we'll use that as the example. So one of the things that we can do is understand what is driving heating load in this particular building. And so this is just a graph showing outdoor air temperature relative to the total combined heating load within the building. We're going to get a little in the weeds here. But to keep it somewhat simple, what you'll notice in orange is that in warm outside air temperatures, where you really wouldn't expect to be heating, we still have heating load in the building. And so that is primarily driven by conditioning ventilation air. So you're cooling it to dehumidify, then you got to reheat it. And then in blue, that's primarily, the vast majority of the heating load is driven by the envelope. And so what are the strategies, if we were thinking as a design team very early in the design process, that we can leverage to reduce these loads? And it's probably small on your screen, but when we think about envelope, this means we need to be thinking about strategies related to air sealing. How do we lower window to wall ratios or optimize our window to wall ratios? How do we add insulation, or at the very least, just make our insulation more effective by minimizing thermal bridging? How do we add insulation where it's necessary, or how do we increase thermal mass? On the ventilation side, can we integrate dual energy recovery? Can we integrate hot gas reheat? Can we split up our ventilation and conditioning loads and add a DOAS unit? Those are kind of the broad strokes, divergence on how we can start to think about available strategies. So I'm going to focus on a few of these, not all of them, we don't have time for that, but on the energy efficiency front for the envelope, I'm going to focus on two that I think are, one, very important, especially for our region, and also very cost effective, often overlooked. So the first is air sealing. And so this is an example of a study where we looked at an existing envelope. We compared options where we either improved the air sealing of the building and added insulation, just added insulation, or just added air sealing. And what we found is that we could get 90% of the impact of full increased insulation and air sealing just by focusing on air sealing. Nuance here, this building had a lot of thermal mass. There's some this would not always be the exact case on every building, but it goes to show the importance of air sealing, especially in our climate zone, where we have humid air, we have cold climate, we have cold conditions, we have hot conditions. We can't control air leakage in and out of our building. We can't control thermal loads. This is something that doesn't necessarily cost anymore. It can on a project, but a lot of it probably just comes down to, do we have the right details? Are we handling our joint conditions appropriately? Are we using the right weather barrier? It doesn't necessarily have to be an exorbitant increase in cost, though. Similarly, thermal bridging. So a thermal bridge is essentially just a weak spot in a building's thermal envelope or the insulation. So this can be where, maybe you have a break with structural components like studs, where you don't have insulation continuous, it's just in the cavity. It could be balconies. It could just be a thinner area of insulation and not just a complete absence of insulation. But these thermal breaks drastically derate the performance of our insulation. So if you throw a bunch of insulation in your building, but you have thermal bridges everywhere, you're not really getting much value out of that insulation and the money that you put towards it. And so there's primarily two types of thermal bridges that occur. There's linear breaks, and you kind of see highlighted in red here. This might be at slab conditions, this might be at balcony conditions, it could be floor to floor. But the idea is that there are well-established details. You don't have to do, you have to do a full WUFI analysis to calculate these. There are a lot of industry resources that help you tell you how you should apply thermal derating factors. In this case, it's called a psi value to your envelope to understand how it's performing when you have these conditions. And if you can improve your details, or if you can kind of reapproach the design, this might be a zero cost change or a minimal cost change to just resolve these thermal bridges. Same thing with point thermal bridging. So might be a pipe penetration or beam penetration. The idea is that it's a discrete location, so it's not linear across the elevation. It's just a single point. These are represented with a chi value. Again, all to say, there are established ways of understanding how these thermal bridges derate the performance of your envelope. And if you can address these thermal bridges, you may not have to add any additional insulation. It might just be a conversation with your structural engineer to understand, can we add a thermal break in this beam? And that would be the extent of it. The reason that this matters is because on this, back to the original case study at this middle school, not only were we looking for opportunities to reduce energy consumption for heating, we also wanted to find opportunities to reduce peak heating demand. And that is, essentially going to equate to how much heating equipment you have to install. And what we found is if we could, in this case, just improve effective insulation value by addressing thermal bridges, going from an effective of R26 to R30, by reducing infiltration, and by increasing the insulation on the perimeter slab condition, we were able to reduce our peak heating demand for this building by, I think, 23%. And that's significant because not only did that reduce annual energy use for heating, but it also makes conversations, again, when we start talking about energy efficient HVAC equipment, much more palatable. And so it's probably common knowledge to the engineers in the room, but when we design HVAC systems, we design for the worst case condition. That worst case condition happens maybe 1% of the year, maybe less than that. And so what this chart is showing you is that small little sliver in red is maybe 30% of the capacity that you're paying for in HVAC equipment, and you will only need that 30% of capacity maybe 1% of the time. And so if you're going to do something like heat pumps, you're going to do something that, you don't optimize your heating loads, you're going to buy a lot of really expensive equipment for that last 30%. And so I call this the power of partial, but it's a great way to think about, one, once we've reduced our loads, once we've achieved that 23% reduction in heating demand, now we can start to think about how do we cost effectively actually meet that load. And in certain cases, Ohio, sometimes being the case where we have a big cost difference between electricity and natural gas, it may not be cost effective to serve that last 30% of load for that 1% of the year with heat pumps. Maybe we could use something else. Maybe we can use a natural gas connection and still have boilers. Ideally, you could use something like thermal storage. But what makes the most sense for heat pumps to leverage them potentially for the entire building if you can get your loads right, or leverage them for at least that 85% of the year where you have drastic less demand for heating energy. This was the case on the study that we looked at, for the building that we looked at, and ultimately the solution that we arrived at was first reducing those peak heating loads. And by reducing it by 23%, essentially what we were able to do is balance the amount of cooling demand. We're going to have equipment for cooling energy. We were able to leverage that same capacity because heat pumps provide both cooling and heating to also provide that 85% of heating demand, and then leverage, in this case, natural gas boilers just for trim heating. So they are just providing, you're only using combustion natural gas for 5 to 10% of annual heating demand. So almost fully electrified. Not only did that reduce upfront costs, it also drastically reduced our energy consumption. Should operate at a 21 DUI. And so how does this relate to the budget? I'm hopefully going to tie this all back together. The reason that this is important is because we did all of this at schematic design. All of this analysis was considered very early in the design process. Front-loaded a lot of that so that when we got into the first round of estimating, we weren't looking at something that was just immediately going to be cut off through value engineering. And before incentives, when we looked at the life cycle cost analysis of these system alternatives, the top line is a ground source heat pump system. I didn't go into detail on that, just for time's sake. We can talk about that later. But what you'll notice is there's two lines at the bottom that essentially overlap each other. And that is the base case option with boilers and air-cooled chillers compared to air source heat pumps. Because we right-size the building loads, because we kind of downsize our air source heat pump equipment, we were basically able to get these two systems to be at cost parity with each other and still a 30% energy savings. When we get to what Andy talks about, In this particular case, there were incentives available that come into effect 1 year after the building is essentially constructed. They can receive this rebate money. And so if we look at this, in this case, geothermal performed the best overall. There are some challenges with that, getting the initial capital. But then what you see is because air source heat pumps were so close to parity in the beginning, they now have a cost benefit over the life cycle. So you're able to get an electrified system. This is in a climate zone 5A, but it's in an eastern state where electricity prices are almost 5 or 6 times more expensive than natural gas per unit of energy. So even with electrical prices being so significantly more expensive, they were still able to make it pencil with utility costs. But none of this would have been possible if we hadn't first front-loaded the design process to incorporate this into the schematic design price estimate. So with that, I'll circle back to what is good design. And so I think we would all say that there's a lot of facets, meeting priorities, a lot of things that go into making up a good design for a project. Some of those are on here. This is not exhaustive. But I think what happens is a lot of times the budgetary constraints, the economics of a project, the pressure to deliver fast and cheap, ultimately focus us as designers and engineers on the first cost elements. And if we only ever do that, I think we miss out not only on benefits to the building in terms of health and wellness and energy efficiency, air quality, we also maybe exclude ourselves from being able to leverage the tools that Andy is going to talk about here in a second that can be an additional value. So an additional capital stack, an additional rebate that then can allow us to incorporate additional things. So we get the energy efficiency, but now we can get improved circadian lighting, or maybe we can get better indoor air quality. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking exhaustively and collaboratively about these things so that we can unlock the best value for our clients. And with that, I will hand it over to Andy. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Wyatt. Before we get into some of the specific financing tools, programs, grants, incentives, et cetera, I want to set the table again just a bit, thinking about some of the things, at least that we see in the energy finance world, that is applicable, particularly during kind of the front stage design phases of the project during pre-construction, et cetera. One of the big things, quite simply, is who's owning the electricity infrastructure in the building and around the building. And that isn't necessarily something that gets a whole lot of airtime on most projects. And so that's why we wanted to spend a minute on it, particularly with increasingly innovative and productive technology solutions that are making more things viable when it comes to the way you look at financing clean energy infrastructure. And so first of all, fundamentally thinking about, well, who's paying the electricity bill, and then starting to align incentives. Typically, it's the tenants through some kind of tenant-owned relationship with the utility company versus the landlord in common area. That's the convention. That doesn't take off everything out of the equation, but that does limit you a bit. However, with some of the tools that we're going to talk about here in a second, we're seeing a lot more disruption to this, which is exciting. It's exciting and complicated. From a regulatory standpoint, in some cases, electric utilities are seeing things that they've never seen before and having to kind of figure things out. And so you have to have some communication there oftentimes if you're bringing forward some innovation. There's also some hybrid models where maybe you, the landlord in a multifamily or multi-tenant setting of some sort, are taking on more responsibilities from a property management standpoint for the electricity that your tenants are paying. And that can happen through different ways. And so anyway, it's just, there's really kind of three, we paint the picture there of 3 different solutions. There's 1,000 different hybrids, but that at a high level is one big piece to it. Another piece to think about is the fact that commercial electricity rates are cheaper than residential rates. And while we all know that, when you master meter a commercial building that would have, say, multifamily tenants, individual residential tenants, but the relationship that the building has to the utility is a single or a couple of commercial meters instead of 100 or 200 residential meters, you are getting the benefit of a large commercial user. And so you're getting commercial rates versus each individual tenant having their own residential rate relationship with the electric utility. And then, of course, if you are taking that on as the landlord, you have to define a way to be able to sub-meter and bill your tenants. And that's a property management question. But fundamentally, right out of the gates, when you're just talking about whatever the amount of electricity is needed for serving a building, if you can meter it commercial versus some combination of commercial and individual residential, you're going to be saving 20, 30% off base rates right off the bat. And that immediately starts to open up doors for innovation, for creativity, and for not getting a lot of the things that Wyatt talked about, hopefully, value engineered out before we dig in too deeply. Another way of getting at this to create more opportunities for clean energy is whether certain energy infrastructure is owned by the building owner, directly owned, versus third-party ownership. Third-party ownership for things like solar through solar leases or solar power purchase agreements are relatively common, not as much common here as they should be. However, geothermal as a service or third-party geothermal financing is starting to become innovated on. And we're going to dig into that, particularly with one of today's underlying themes being focused on advancing the geothermal marketplace. And so we wanted to share a little bit about where we're seeing some of this disruption. So when I talk about different ways of metering, we don't say that lightly. We recognize that if you're a multifamily building, affordable or market rate, doesn't matter, or really any kind of multi-tenant structure, and there's this notion that you are yourself owning the electricity meters, which is the picture on the left, where you, the owner, are owning this, not the traditional approach of the electric utility owning them, or you're just in some way, based on the graph on the right, having an algorithm or a process by which you allocate costs to tenants. If you have a large solar array on your roof and over the parking lot, for example, and a master meter relationship with the electric utility, and then your own meters to allocate that electricity that is coming from solar to each of your individual tenants, you have a process that might be based on square footage, it may be based on other types of usage characteristics, it might be based on income even, if you are a multifamily building owner or developer. And so in one way, shape, or form, it's just worth repeating that there's an increasing amount of technology out there that allows for greater flexibility in how you think about some of these really fundamental, and quite honestly, there's a very routine way to do it, and then there's some different ways to do it. And we just, I think, encourage you more than anything to at least consider a little bit of innovation on some of the new ways to do this next time you're in the planning stages. And when it comes to the access to capital, part of why you might want to do this is the idea that you are increasing the energy efficiency. That means you're decreasing the energy costs. That means you are increasing the net income of the building, the net operating income of the building, and thus allowing for your owner, your landlord, to gain more access to capital. If they're increasing NOI, they should be able to go to Fifth Third Bank or wherever to be able to get more debt to encumber what is sometimes, and maybe often, some added cost in the CapEx upfront. So if you're thinking, yes, this stuff costs more upfront, it can, and certainly Wyatt has started to address that, and we all know that, I think, probably from being in a lot of these conversations. We're not ignoring that, but what we are saying is model it out the back end, demonstrate that there is a high level of reliance on the fact that costs are meaningfully reduced, and now your NOI is going to go up, and that cost, that ability for you to get capital is going to increase as well. And that, at the end of the day, should be able to make a project like this not just seem like it's easy to value engineer out, when the operating costs, the life cycle costs, are far in excess of the incremental capital cost up front. And so as we kind of dig into a few tools here, we think of them in a couple different ways. One, and these are, by the way, public-private tools. So what we haven't done is, for today's conversation, is provided a deep scan of off-the-shelf private market financing solutions. But Jeremy gave you the stats from Fifth Third earlier. They're doing billions of clean energy financing. You may not have realized they're doing that much. Other banks are too. And so this is becoming more commonplace. A lot of the tools that we want to bring to you today have some kind of public-private nature to it. where it's a tax incentive or a rebate from somewhere, and it generally needs to get tied into something else to actually make it happen. And so generally these are happening, these are deriving from funding sources at the local, state, or national level, for one. And then at a high level, we sort of bucket them into three different categories. We've got grants, dollar for dollar, although there's never any such thing really as free money. So there's always some hair to it that you got to kind of know what you're getting into. Tax incentives, so something that comes through some level of a taxing jurisdiction to subsidize the project. And then, of course, third-party financing or loans that can kind of sweep up the rest of the capital that needs to come into the project. And so to dig in a little bit to these, before we do that, I'm a CPA, and so I have a little disclaimer here. I'm not going to read it, but because we're going to get into the tax code and a few things like that, I need to kind of throw this up here so I can say a few things without saying I'm going to stamp your tax return. First of all, and I mentioned this earlier, but the Cincinnati Development Fund has very much been at the table, leading the Cincinnati Green Bank effort and leading hard to reach financing of affordable housing and community development projects in our region for decades. They are evolving and expanding for the benefit of clean energy deployment. And so when it comes specifically to their tools, the list up here, if you've interacted with them in the past, might be familiar to you, but they have expanded their toolbox specifically as it relates to the recognition that that I said earlier. They want to lend you more money if you have a project when there's a demonstration of measurable and tangible energy savings that will be justified in that project. And so CDF, Cincinnati Development Fund, if you're not already familiar with them, is a local nonprofit lender. They're a community development finance institution. Their focus is on affordable multifamily housing and community facilities. And so they do a lot of nonprofit lending for upgrades or new construction as well. So for any of you all that are participating in that marketplace, and you go to CDF and you realize that you have this opportunity for a $200,000 federal tax credit for a solar project, but there's this timing gap of when you're going to actually get the money versus when you need it up front. Like any tax credit, there's oftentimes a gap. And you go to CDF and say, can you help me fill that gap? They're going to be very deeply knowledgeable on that, the understanding of that tax credit and that structure, and the idea of underwriting this unique, 18-month, 2-year, 3-year time frame to get you the pre-development financing you need, and then the time you have to wait around for the federal government via the IRS to get you your tax credit. So there's a range of tools that they have, and they're innovating on top of the cool things they've already been doing for decades. There's a grant available at the state of Ohio called the Advanced Energy Grant. This is administered through the Ohio Department of Development. I think when it comes to the energy efficiency side of things, there's a 15% savings requirement. It does require an ASHRAE Level 2 energy audit. So this is where, again, up front, this is more so, not a new construction, this is more so for deferred maintenance or existing building retrofit purposes. There's a larger version of the program, and then in a minute we're going to talk about the smaller version of the program. Either way, this is a program that typically opens up once a year. There has been instances where this has opened up a second time a year. We are getting to the end of the state's fiscal year, ending June 30. And so sometime likely in the fall, both of these programs for grants are going to open back up. Historically speaking, these grants have subsidized community facilities, local government, energy upgrades, and things like that. And so it's definitely a tool worth knowing about. And quite honestly, I think we'd love to see more of these dollars come to Southwest Ohio than maybe they have historically. It is an interesting wording that we took directly from the state's website to cover almost everybody, yes. And so it is broadly applicable, but for existing buildings. Yeah. There are some federal requirements you have to keep in mind too: Buy America, Build America, Davis-Bacon, some of the other favorites that we have when we're dealing with federal funds. So that's worth mentioning as well. But it's definitely a great program that I think is potentially underutilized, at least in Southwest Ohio. There's a forthcoming knock on wood program that we want to make sure we share with you all, which is because of its significance. It is not live yet in Ohio nor Kentucky, but it is live in Indiana. And this is an output of the Inflation Reduction Act's $8.5 billion program funding home energy rebates for lower income single and multifamily properties. And so there are about 13 states that have rolled out this program where it's already active. The other states, including Ohio and Kentucky, have been in a holding pattern for the last 15 months or so. However, just 2 weeks ago, the Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, did say in a public setting that there's an anticipation that this program does get rolled out here in quote unquote weeks. And so the reason that this is worth mentioning, even though it's not live yet, with all the disclaimers and the fact that nobody in the room has direct control over it, however, it's significant. And so we should get ready as a region to help bring these dollars to our community, because it's going to be focused likely initially on existing buildings again. So single and multifamily folks, 150% of the area median income and below. So there is some income qualifications, like a lot of these programs do often have, but very significant and robust rebates totaling probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $26,000 to $28,000 per unit. So in a single family home, that's your max. In a multifamily building, you're talking about tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars of total subsidy, and there is no cost share that is required. When the math works itself out with the various kind of hoops that are inside the program, there might be some kind of cost share. But at a fundamental level, I mean, we're seeing this program on the ground work in Indiana right now, and we're seeing the state cut checks for hundreds of thousands of dollars to, medium and large affordable housing complexes, and certainly $10,000 and $20,000 checks to single-family homeowners. There are contractors that are in our community that are registered and working in the Indiana program today. There are energy auditors that are engaging in that program today. And so it is exciting from the standpoint of the fact that we are tri-state. We have a little bit of an edge here where some of our businesses are working in the program already in another state. And so as soon as Ohio, Kentucky open up, hopefully it's something that could be very robust. And so make sure that, albeit not on the new construction or redevelopment side, at least initially, it can do that, but it probably won't do that out of the gates. It's a very robust program that we felt was worth sharing with you all if you weren't already familiar with it for a minute or two. To the credit of the city of Cincinnati sponsoring this effort, we are a region, and so we are talking about regional tools, as I mentioned in the last slide. And so even though, again, in Ohio, we haven't had the benefit of utility rebates, our neighboring states have. And so it's just worth mentioning, we still see a lot of times getting involved in projects on the front end where a lot of times, certainly specifically Duke Energy, has new construction oriented rebates around getting custom enhanced incentives on projects based on energy models. So this goes outside of their standard kind of prescriptive list of measures and how you get the rebates, and it's going to be based on modeled savings. And so again, that's where, from the design perspective, if you're trying to figure out how to overcome some kind of additional increment that a highly designed building is going to get you, that's certainly a tool that does seem to get left out quite a bit, and is something worth looking at as long as you're not in Ohio. There's a newly rolled out rebate program for EV charging in Kentucky. This just came out on April 13th. We've been updating these slides over the course of the month that we've been working with CMTA in the city as these things change literally by the week, sometimes it seems. These are old leftover Volkswagen diesel emissions lawsuit settlement funds, if that is a familiar legal phenomenon to anybody, only to say that they are here, they are open. So if you have any clients in Kentucky anywhere that might have an interest, now is the time for them to engage in the grant application effort. They're getting awarded on a first come, first served basis until the funds are gone. And so it is a little bit of a race to kind of get applications in. Definitely something worth considering and applicable to just about any type of building. Right here in our backyard, we have for 1 to 4 unit properties, and we have made an effort in these financial tools to cover a lot of different building types and use types, knowing that people are coming from different places in the marketplace. And so there is still, as many of you may know, a fairly broad opportunity on 1 to 4 unit properties that are going under new construction or renovation to get an increment of a couple $100,000 for certain green incentive certifications. And so the city lists out LEED and some discrete incentives, and there's also kind of a bit of a broad brush language in the regulation as well that allows for other modeling ideas to be put forward. And so that is just to say that if this building type is relevant to anyone in the room, and you're again thinking about how to encumber additional costs up front, recognizing that you could see some significant savings over time, there's certainly a tool there on the tax side that is beneficial for 1 to 4s in the city. Jumping up to the state level, there's a state agency by the name of the Ohio Air Quality Development Authority. They've been around for 55 years, although it's a state agency that is pretty unique to Ohio and one that possibly not all in the room have even run into before. They are an independent state agency, as I mentioned. Their board is a group of gubernatorial appointees, and they have some fairly broad statutory authority to deliver sales and property tax exemptions on commercial, so multifamily or any other commercial building, for achieving certain levels of energy efficiency in design. And even if you haven't heard of them, know that you won't be the first or anywhere near the first project if you do consider it the next time you're involved in one, because they have a portfolio today of more than $3 billion in projects that they're managing over time. And so this gives you a little bit of a picture of where they've seen some activity. We have seen some nice activity, generally speaking, down here in Southwest Ohio. The deals that are in red, the circles that are in red, are 2025 activity specifically. So you can see some nice concentration here. So we are seeing this tool get put in front of more and more communities here in our backyard. And it's definitely something that is worth considering more deeply. Across the 600 projects, that's where they've gotten up to now, about $3.6 billion. And so there's primarily 2 programs that we're going to talk about today that the Ohio Air Quality Development Authority administers. And for all intents and purposes, they're pretty similar programs, except one is more streamlined for smaller projects. One is a little bit more involved for larger projects. The first for smaller projects is the new name that they've given it, called the Small Business Clean Air Program. Fundamentally, what we're talking about is for an energy efficiency project sized 2 million and below in an owner-occupied small business or similar type of commercial structure to be able to benefit from a fairly streamlined effort to gain a property tax incentive on that increment. So on that, if you're spending $1 million on solar on a factory somewhere, for example, you can get through this program a property tax incentive on that $1 million. Also through this program, get a sales tax incentive on that same million. So you won't pay any sales tax on that energy scope, and the amount of the value of that project will be exempt from your property taxes for what is typically somewhere between 20 and 25 years. And so it adds up over time, obviously. And so if you have a building that has a significant energy retrofit of some sort and a number of measures going in, this could be very beneficial to be able to take advantage of. On the higher end of this program is a little bit more complexity, but a little bit more robustness when it comes to the financing viability of a lot of the things that we in CMTA team have been talking about today. And so for larger projects, this would be any project, either any multifamily project, 5 units or greater, or any project of any sort that is over 2 million in size. There is really a fork in the road, so to speak, of how big do you want to go. So back to a lot of those front-end discussions that Wyatt was alluding to around savings and looking at a 15% pathway versus a 50% pathway. And we're going to be comparing 15% savings to the design as modeled. And so in other words, baseline building code is going to be our baseline minimum if we're talking about new construction or major renovation. If we're talking about an existing building, it's simply going to be based on historical energy usage. And so then we're going to try to get 15% higher to get some incentive, 50% higher to get quite a bit of incentive. Conventionally, in a new construction project, when we're talking about 15% savings pathway, we see that about 30 or 35% of the total spend of the new construction project, hard and soft costs, are eligible to go through for these tax exemptions. And so that alone is significant. And so when you're sizing out 7.75% sales tax on a $3 million tranche of a $10 million new construction project, that number alone is meaningful. On top of that, you have that same $3 million, just using my hypothetical here, that is exempt from property taxes. So that $10 million property is now taxed as a $7 million property, assuming a county auditor assesses it in the same way that you put into it, based on the value you put into it, which is never that easy. But that $3 million tranche is going to be removed from the value that the county auditor says it's worth. And so you're going to get that 25-year exemption on the property taxes, as well as that same amount on the sales tax. Yeah, Chad. Baseline building code. And so on the 50% pathway, we typically see that the value of that exemption goes up from maybe 30% of the budget to something like 60 or 70% of the budget, maybe higher. And so it's significant. It kind of needs to be, because when you're jumping up to 50, now we're talking about something probably that's going to change in design, if not a couple things. To change in design from what any developer or builder would consider conventional. That might be geothermal. That might be solar. But if we're going to really probe geothermal today, it is International Geothermal Month, after all, which is true. If we're going to probe geothermal today and hear a lot about geothermal today, and you might see a 10 or 20% incremental cost up front for geothermal, we'll recognize that this is a very unique benefit that can likely more than pay for itself from the tax savings over time. Yeah, so the question was kind of sizing out the value of that tax exemption as it relates to the cost that's going in. And so on a $10 million new construction commercial project of any sort, just to make it simple, if you're pursuing that 50% energy savings compared to baseline building code, we typically at least start to the financial model at the assumption that 6 million of it is going to be exempt from sales and property tax, as opposed to, which is obviously a lot more than just the cost of that measure, right? To your question. Okay. Another piece that can help fund geothermal and other clean energy investment, and is not gone, despite, again, a lot of noise at the federal government level, but is changing and does have near-term deadlines. And so bottom right corner first, with the nearest term deadline, the 30C EV charging tax credit is going by the wayside here in a few months at the end of June. Long story short, it's going to be there at 30% for nonprofit or for-profit owned buildings based on certain geographies, but act now if you haven't started to act already for that one. Upper left for the solar tax credit, the one big bill back in July of 2025 did significantly accelerate the phasing down of this tax credit. As many of you may know, it is not gone, but it is on a relatively short leash where the project has to be put in service by the end of 2027. That's probably at this stage the most important deadline. The project getting fully in service, the solar project getting fully in service and turned on by the end of 2027. The other two quadrants are going to be around with us for a while. One, the bottom left, our favorite feature of the day here, geothermal, which isn't going anywhere through 2032. So that's why I know we as a team are super excited to be digging into this. Grateful to the city and CMTA to, in the second session, dig in deep on the market potential study for geothermal to start to really demystify the technology and know that there's financing innovation that's already happening alongside that too. to make this an increasingly viable solution. Last but not least is battery storage, which we are starting to see more of, I think, particularly when you think about the resiliency applications to this. We're seeing city buildings and nonprofit buildings and others try to figure out how to keep the lights on in the case of a weather event. And certainly in order to do that, you have to have some battery storage connected. This is the structure of the tax credit. I'm going to start to speed up my delivery a little bit here to get us to the end and allow for questions. Only to say at the end of the day we're talking about those measures on the previous slide coming in at a baseline of 30%, conceivably up to as high as 70%, although it's a bit of threading the needle to get all the way there. But there's some different pieces to the puzzle that allow you to get a richer tax incentive that really makes a difference when you start to model out. And these are things you really need to be thinking about during design, because in order to maximize, for example, and get that 40% bump or the 10% bump for domestic content, you obviously got to be thinking about that during the procurement process. Where am I getting my solar? Where am I getting my geothermal? What requirements am I putting on bidding vendors to say, demonstrate to me that you are able to meet these terms and conditions for the domestic content requirements? So those are the types of things, in addition to the financial modeling, that are really important to be thinking about up front. When it comes to the geothermal component specifically, there's a lot of really interesting stuff to think about. We won't go into too much detail on it, only to say that the applicability of the federal tax credit, when you get into a cost segregation study on the budget, and the expanse of the HVAC system, when it's anchored by geothermal technology, there are a great number of elements of that geothermal of that HVAC budget that you can bring into the tax credit eligibility column. And so go out and find somebody that can help your team do that, is the short answer. But recognize that that you might have geothermal as a line item, and you know, ducts and everything else as other line items, but there's quite likely other line items in that budget that you can bring into the eligibility for the tax credit, just given how broad the geothermal tax credit language is written and the ability to make as much out of that tax credit as possible. And lastly, on the financing side, I think this is almost last one, is the fact that you can increasingly see third-party owned geothermal systems in the same way that we've long seen third-party owned solar systems. And so you could call it geothermal as a service. This is a third-party ownership of some sort in order to be able to monetize the federal tax credit in a cost-effective way, but still bring to bear the robustness that is geothermal into a project. The federal tax credit can be monetized through a range of different ways. The long story short is that it doesn't matter if you're a for-profit or a nonprofit, you can still monetize the tax credit. And so you can actually get a federal tax credit if you're a tax-exempt entity. That phenomenon is called direct pay or elective pay. Hopefully it's something you've heard of. If you haven't yet, there's a bunch of slides in this deck, but at the end in an appendix that take you into a little bit of a deeper dive there. One other loan to just share with you is available and has been around since 2000. This is limited to 1 to 4 unit properties, but it is applicable to investment properties. It is a subsidized loan program through linked deposits that Hamilton County Treasury puts on file. At this case, in this case, exclusively at this point with Northside Bank. And it's essentially a subsidy of 3% on your loan, offering you a 4 to 5% interest rate, either single family, so something we all might want to take advantage of at our homes, or again, an investment property, your interest rate might bump up to about 5%. So a great tool that's out there. There's also a state revolving loan fund, which is structured similarly, except it's a loan and not a grant, to the Advanced Energy Grant that we talked about earlier. Hot off the press, another piece of House Bill 15 that Nikki alluded to is a new $46 million capacity in a solar, a school-focused solar and energy efficiency loan fund. And so it's brand new. The guidelines aren't even out yet fully, or at least haven't been posted fully. It's been making its way through bureaucracy. These are funds that got transferred from one state department to another after they were dormant for several years. to sit now in the Ohio Facilities Construction Commission and offer a 2% loan product up to 10 years for a range of solar and energy efficiency measures, but it is focused only on public K-12. Lastly is PACE. Property Assessed Clean Energy has been in Ohio since 2009. It's very unique in the sense that it is off balance sheet, non-recourse, long-term, up to 30-year debt. A lot of times this is co-lent alongside conventional debt in a case where there might be a need for some kind of mezzanine debt or an ability to reduce the equity requirement that a project has to get a deal done. The financing sits on the property tax bill and not on the debt load, so you repay it through a special assessment, increasing your property taxes just like you would pay for sewers or sidewalks or other things that you pay through the tax bill. And so it's very unique in the sense that it can stay with the property in the case of transfer. Ohio is actually number 2 in the country in terms of PACE deal volume at almost $1 billion. And so there has been a lot of track record for that here in our backyard. And so I think just to bring it home for us, this is happening, this crazy stuff, or it's hopefully not so crazy, especially with those in the room that are self-selected to be here and spend a couple hours of time today. We're seeing more of this activity in a lot of different ways happen right here in our own backyard, even with some of the case studies happening from outside of our region. And so anecdotally, you know, that kind of unique approach towards solar that we talked about, there's no database for that. There's just at least five projects that we happen to have direct experience or knowledge of happening in our backyard that are looking at or are activating on various versions of what we shared with you. There are over 30 local governments in Southwest Ohio and Northern Kentucky that have passed PACE legislation. And then as we showed on the screen slides ago, Southwest Ohio is one of the heaviest concentration for OAQDA-backed projects as well. And then lastly, when it comes to EV charging, there are over 700 apartment listings currently in our region that list EV charging as an amenity. And so that number even blew us away, and we've been in the EV business for about 8 years. One really cool project that I think the second session with the CMTA team is going to shed light on around the viability of something like district geothermal is a cool creative case study up in St. Paul, Minnesota, where their green bank, the Minnesota Climate Innovation Finance Authority, offered low interest loan as a part of a large mixed use redevelopment that included a district geothermal that has a number of commercial multifamily and light industrial buildings going into this, what used to be a golf course. And each of the new buildings that are coming on are required to tie in to the district geothermal system. That is enabled in part by a federal tax credit that I talked about earlier, and a nearly $5 million low interest loan from their state green bank. This is a cool and fairly old case study in our neighboring state of Indiana on a big geothermal system that Ball State did a number of years ago. And so again, just to kind of demystify the fact that this is happening, it has been happening, and I think an educated guess would suggest that it's going to happen a lot more in the near future here. With respect to some of the third-party ownership of solar, I can't go without making sure to share that while we don't see as a community a lot of this idea around third-party ownership of energy infrastructure, we have started to see it. And one of the coolest and most innovative projects in recent memory, certainly, I think, is by the port, and Andrew Fisher's here with the port, but they built 8 new townhomes on Concord Street in Walnut Hills. 4 of them have solar. These are being sold to 100% AMI folks and below. And the 4 that have solar, the port was able to structure an innovative financing solution such that the port will maintain ownership of the solar system for 5 years beyond when they sell the house to the homeowner in order to be able to make the most out of the federal tax credit, as well as offloading the responsibility and what could seem like a new or overwhelming aspect of managing solar system to a likely first-time homeowner. And so they do that as a commercial nonprofit entity, maintaining that solar ownership, and are able to recoup some of their investment through an electricity contract, and then make the most out of the federal tax credit on behalf of a homeowner who likely wouldn't be able to make anything out of the federal tax credit, and thus ultimately pass through a significant amount of the tax credits by virtue of savings to the homeowner, which especially for lower income folks is the most important thing on that whole slide. Financial innovation, but it's more about what it enables. This is just an interesting case study that I'll leave you with and not talk more about, but it's focused on showing a real example of reduced operating expenses, getting access to more capital in order to make these deals happen. Here's a little bit of an example, I think, of what is a lot of stuff out there. If you haven't dug into it, it's worth taking a peek around what is going on in the geothermal marketplace. There is a tremendous amount of private equity investment going in. There is a tremendous amount of financial innovation that is going in. This just gives an example of several $100 million funding raises for new or enhanced technologies that are hopefully at the end of the day making these types of design solutions much more viable for everyone in the room, much less the bankers and financiers that want to see these things happen. And so, as was said earlier, we have one more workshop during this busy month. It's both Earth Month and Geothermal, International Geothermal Awareness Month. And so, hope you can join us tomorrow for more on House Bill 15 than I shared, which is, at the end of the day, one of the most, probably the most consequential clean energy legislation in Ohio, on the positive side, in a very long time. And so, there's more to it going on, and it's certainly worth knowing about. You have our contact information there, and I want to make sure that I leave you on the screen. If we have a few minutes, maybe a couple minutes for Q&A. I think we do have a couple of minutes, but there is a survey on the other side of that QR code. So like any good grant-funded effort here, we want to make sure that we get your feedback, and you'll be asked for feedback again after the next session. We do value that feedback, and all that feedback gets both read and submitted ultimately to those that are able to fund this effort to bring this information forward. So I'm going to pause there. Would love to open the floor up if there's any other questions. And just so you know, while you're thinking of your questions, after a little bit of Q&A here, we're going to take a little break, and then we're going to come back together and dig into the geothermal market potential study that CMTA and team are, for the first time ever, releasing today. So, any questions? Okay, yeah, go ahead. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, having design professionals that have the stomach to digest it and get it, and actually, I think, help deliver those specifications that doesn't hurt. But I think at the end of the day, we tried to offer some links. You also have a one-pager, and on that one-pager is like we attempted to summarize 71 slides into a single sheet, front and back, where there's at least some direct links and some people's names at the state agencies or city agencies that own it. Some are more specific than others because the federal tax credit is obviously a little bit broader base. But that's a resource, and certainly to dig into a little bit more detail, happy to take any other kind of detail offline. Just recognizing the fact that yes, a lot of these things don't see the light of day because there's complexities or at least perceived complexities around interacting with any government agency at any level that might slow things down unduly. And so I think there's at least a handful of people in the room and around the community that have done this enough with some of those tools that can hopefully help streamline anything that that could be perceived as bumpy in a lot of those programs. Yeah. All right. Yeah, go ahead. It does go beyond what's just in the ground, and my eyeballs go over to my colleague Ian, who gets into the weeds on this on projects, but it is more expansive than that, and quite honestly, we've started off with some more conservative estimates of scoping, kind of on the pre-construction side of things, and as the project progresses and the specificity comes into place, and we apply the rules around the project at more the completed or near completed stage, it's always a lot more than we anticipated. So of course, every project's different, but it definitely does go into the billing. Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll take a 5 or 10 minute break, and we'll reconvene here shortly to hear more about geothermal market potential.